Welcome. I'm Chris Krebs, co-chair of the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder. Thank you for joining us. This session is part of a series of briefings on mis and disinformation hosted by the Aspen Institute in tandem with our Commission on Information Disorder. We're talking to top experts in the field who can help us make sense of the various facets of the information crisis. These are designed as a resource for our commissioners and the broader public. We hope you find this series, which we're calling the Disinformation Discussions, both useful and informative. In today's episode, I'm speaking with John Poulos. John is the president and CEO of Dominion Voting, a leading industry supplier of election technology across the United States. Dominion is one of several providers of election technology in the United States, but in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, they soon became a target of rampant disinformation as the big lie began to take hold. From vaccine distributors to 5G and now election vendors, the commercial sector and brands are quickly finding themselves in the crosshairs of disinformation campaigns. We've seen these conspiracy theories creep up in the far corners of the internet and quickly take hold, moving themselves into the mainstream and causing significant damage. As John knows far too well, business executives must now be on high alert and play an active role in preventing disinformation from spreading across their own companies in order to maintain trust in their brand. Because once you've lost trust, it's difficult to get back. All right, John. Well, thanks for being with us here today. The effect disinformation has had on your own company is hard to understand. I think we both kind of saw this play out in real time, and help us understand what you've learned here, where you think we as a commission can take action to prevent this same thing from happening to others, and maybe do this in a way. Tell us the story. Maybe you can start by explaining when your company first noticed these conspiracies around Dominion voting machines, when they were starting to take hold and become a central point of the big lie.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Chris. I guess where I'll start is kind of explaining what we do. We provide technology to election officials who are ultimately accountable and have the authority to run elections across the country. In the United States, it's done on a distributed basis, mostly at the county level. And it's these local officials that actually are accountable for running their elections. The thing that companies like Dominion do is provide technology that helps election officials tally paper ballots. These paper ballots are created by voters one way or another through pens or other assistive devices. And ultimately, it's these pieces of paper that voters verify themselves, they cast their ballots, and then they put them in the ballot box. And our technology simply just tallies those paper ballots. The one thing that we have done, and it's been repeatedly shown since this last fall's election, is our systems accurately tally paper ballots. Now, from our vantage point, it's not that unusual that individuals that lose elections look for other answers for their loss. It's certainly not the first time people have explained or tried to explain their election results through falsehoods, a lot of which have been percolating in the dark corners of the internet. What's new, frankly, for us and for the entire elections community is how fast this disinformation spread and how quickly it escalated. So back in November, there was a real effort to undermine the results of the 2020 general election. So we had people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani who told lies about us. They told lies about the history of our company, about the jurisdictions that we don't even provide services to. And it was all part of this massive defamation campaign. Central to this campaign was the fact that their lies and lies of others were amplified by institutions that have massive megaphones like Fox News and many other media outlets. So these defamers throughout this entire process ignored all of the facts that they were repeatedly sent and shown. They ignored reports from bipartisan officials from across the country They ignored the fact that Powell and Giuliani and others had zero credible evidence. And those are not my words. Those are the words of various judges from across the country, many of whom were appointed by Trump. And central to this is how far and fast it spread, and the scope of the damage that it caused, incalculable economic damage to Dominion, and in the process, severely impacting our democracy.
So, as I think back, whether it was the late days of October or right around November 3rd, where the seeds were not just planting, but germinating and starting to sprout. And then really it was full bore throughout November. And I think about Hammer and Scorecard and the Kraken and that press conference here in DC. I think that was on the 12th. No, that was on the 19th, right? That Thursday.
That's right.
So tell me, it's not like these things are seared in my brain, much like I'm sure they're seared in yours those weeks. So tell me, what were some of the immediate steps that you took? You talked about the facts, right? So what does that mean? That you were sending statements, you're commenting on the record or background? What were some of the immediate steps you took to combat the disinformation that was polluting the ecosystem?
Right. Well, from our standpoint, we pushed back hard on setting the record straight. So we were providing facts to not just the defamers themselves, the news media that were promoting them, but everywhere we could, to election officials. We were pushing it to the public through our website. The real problem, though, Chris, is that the reach that our metaphoric megaphone had was far less than what the defamation campaign had in the way of Fox News and others. So by putting out factual information and frankly third-party factual information by institutions like CISA, like the EAC, like federally approved test labs, bipartisan election officials, and the like, we took every step possible to mitigate the enormous damage that they were causing to us. What was completely unpredictable, and I never in a million years would have expected it, was just how the size of this and the pervasiveness of their defamation. I mean, Chris, it's however many months, is it 7 or so months after the election, and it's just as bad today as it was in those days of November that you mentioned. The impact that it's having for us, for our employees, is devastating. I mean, you put aside the economic devastation that it's caused our company. For our election officials, we still have election officials across the country, not just linked to Dominion, but any election officials that are being targeted, harassed, threatened. We have poll workers that are reticent and reluctant to sign up for upcoming elections. And it continues to take a massive toll far beyond the company with our democratic system.
So I definitely want to dig into the harms, but let's put that aside just for a moment. We'll swing back around to it in a few minutes. So let's kind of just close out on the tactical side of what Dominion, what your peers, there were other companies involved, Smartmatic, for instance. What did you find tactically that worked? And maybe if it worked at one level, but not as at a bigger level or a broader scale, in what just flat out didn't work. And I think where from my experience at CISA, what we thought worked, was effective, was rumor control, right? We had a website where we were taking a broad cross-section of credible voices, the authoritative sources, whether law or the experts in the field, and presented that information, as you said earlier. It's factual, read up yourself. Now, it worked to a certain extent, right? So when we're talking about amplification across Twitter, the CISA Twitter account only had 100,000 followers, and we didn't necessarily have a set of super spreaders on the other side that were amplifying. My own personal Twitter account, where I, was perhaps a little bit more aggressive in some of the messaging, I had 10,000 followers. So tell me a little bit about, what worked, and at what point did it maybe stop working?
Well, from my point of view, with the benefit of hindsight, it really depends on which segment of the U.S. voter base that you're talking about. So when you look at the harmful effects that this disinformation effect has really had in undermining trust of democracy, you're talking to a group of voters that will not look at your Twitter feed. And if they did, the second that you start speaking verifiable truths and evidence, the type of evidence that is presented in courts, and we have a legal system to weigh, they will start blocking you. They'll say you're part of the deep state, and that's really the new dynamic that we're seeing with this in particular defamation campaign, and why it's so particularly dangerous. So I frankly believe that there's tens of millions of people who continue to believe these lies. They believe them because the purveyors of the lies are the way that they said it. Their message resonated with these voters. These voters were emotional. They cared deeply about this election, and they were told in such a malicious way that those people believed what they were hearing from them, and also from the news sources that were carrying them and carrying their message as their own from news desks and from very trusted officials on TV at Fox News and other media outlets. And in the process, they ignore the countless of reliable bipartisan, the nonpartisan fact checkers. So you mentioned the rumor control. I think that was one of the first things that was ignored, and it was thrown out the window and is labeled as, whatever they called it, rhino or deep state. They have their own verbiage that discounts it, and it's these voters that continue to believe it. And that's how I measure the harm that this is having to our democratic institutions, and it's devastating. I think from a standpoint of our company, it's irreparable. And I just hope that through continued education and an unrelenting education platform of how we educate voters of the voting process, of the fact that there's paper ballots that are considered the gold standard simply because they can be hand counted, and in a proper audit, hand counted by bipartisan officials with members of the public present, and being administrated by actual experts that actually understand how elections work and how the process should be run. So the truth, the truth in all this is that the systems have been proven accurate. If you look since November, we've been involved, our systems alone, not to mention our competitors, our systems have been proven accurate in over 1,000 hand recounts and audits since November, about the November election. And this is why it's the gold standard, but the disinformation was so malicious and so well targeted that you have these voters that are continuing to believe it.
So John, these are the sorts of things that I can sit here and talk about for hours and hours and hours. What we're seeing right now is in states like Arizona are what has been described generously as an audit. But you and I both, and every single election official out there, knows that an audit is an established process with a series of best practices, accepted policies. I think the closest, what a real audit, in fact, is what's happening in New Hampshire. So let's talk a little bit more about what we think. What do we need to do going forward? And how do we restore trust? You've touched on this about more transparency, more education. The thing that it really occurred to me, at least during the 2020 election, is that there are some election jurisdictions, states, counties that are exceptional in their transparency, their communication skills. in how they open up the process and bring the public in, not just into the voting process by voting, but into the voting process by participating and tracking and engaging and updating. I think those that are more of a black box open up the process to more of these conspiracy theories and questions. And then, tying it back around to Arizona, there is an established audit process in Arizona. There were several audits that preceded this, the current activity. So let's, what is your take on what more the vendors can do, what more election officials can do to build back trust, to create transparency, to open up the process to the voters?
Sure. Well, first off, as it pertains to vendors of technology, I mean, it's pretty simple. We don't make the rules. We don't make the regulations. That's for legislators and government officials to do that. We simply have the job of complying and putting our systems through whatever third-party testing the state and local officials deem appropriate and necessary. So when you mention various jurisdictions having different levels of transparency, I don't think that that's something that was necessarily planned. But frankly, just from an evolutionary standpoint of certain jurisdictions gained a lot of interest. So if you look at Florida, for example, in the aftermath of 2000, there was a lot of public interest in how elections were run. And the group of election supervisors down in Florida, along with the Secretary of State's office, did an exceptional job of addressing the issues from a technological standpoint, from an audit standpoint, from a public transparency standpoint. If you look at what California did, California recognized problems as long ago as 2004, for example. They came out with a sweeping new state standard for state certification, complete with both red team and blue team testing. They invite the public in for public and logic and accuracy testing. They perform penetration tests fairly regularly. Same with New York. And I think that what you're seeing is in some jurisdictions in some states, that interest just hasn't been there. The problems haven't manifested in prior elections. And so they haven't had the benefit of having gone through that. In the state of Georgia, which is a state that I know a little about, if you look at how far they've come in such a short time frame, we talk about official audits. The state of Georgia recounted roughly 5 million paper ballots for the office of president in complete view of media cameras, bipartisan poll workers and officials. Is extremely transparent. And that's simply just one of the hand count audits that I was referencing before.
And I think, that's what's so distinct about the official processes is that they say, like in Georgia, like in Michigan with the hand count they conducted up there. So, in all over the country, it's election professionals say, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're hoping to achieve. And here's how long it's going to take. They tell you what they're going to do, and then they go do it. And then they allow, as I was mentioning earlier, the voters to participate by observing and tracking throughout the process. That to me
and Chris, let me interrupt, and frankly, it makes sense. So if I'm going to tell you we want to audit a particular race, we're going to give you a stack of ballot. We're going to give you and 4 other bipartisan poll watchers and officials, even members of the public. We're going to give you a stack of ballots, and if you all agree that there's a vote for candidate 1, put it in this pile. If it's a vote for candidate 2, put it in this pile, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't agree, put it in another pile, and we'll address them as we go forward. That makes sense to everybody, and that's you're recounting what voters actually put down on their ballots. What we're seeing in some of the other places just make no sense, and especially since they're not even telling you what they're doing and why they're doing it and what they hope to achieve, per your point.
Yeah. So let's shift gears here. You alluded earlier to whether it's election officials getting threats, your own employees, you personally, look, I've been there with you. What happened over the course of this election cycle with the threats that were directed towards officials that were just participating in the democratic process and trying to provide the mechanisms by which everybody can vote. Tell us a little bit about what sorts of harms has this disinformation had on your company, on your employees, and what's the broader harm in democracy going forward? Thinking about 2022, 2024, are we going to see this all again? What's your take on where we are right now and some of the harms that have been levied?
Well, with specific regard to the company, despite the fact that we did everything we could to mitigate the damage it caused us, it's already been irreparable in scale. It's increased the cost of doing business for us. It continues to reduce our market opportunity. The reality, as we now have no choice but to accept it, is that we're just not going to get as many contracts as we used to. All that is afforded to us at this point is seeking justice in court, which I know you know about, but it's something that I never would have predicted 8 months ago. As they say, when you're going through hell, you keep going, and that's what we're doing. But as it's hard to quantify the effect that it's had and how emotional it's been for not just the economic standpoint from the company, but from an employee standpoint. We have employees that have staked their reputations on their work over 20, 30 years. And only to have now friends and family question that because of the defamation campaign, which is 100% based in lies that were told knowingly with malicious intent. I feel like there was another question in there that I forgot.
So I know how hard it is to talk about personally specifically the threats to persons. So the threats to your employees, the threats you received. It's an emotional issue. It's hard to talk about, and where does it end? Where does it stop? And then there's the different kind of threats, and just the broader reputational harm. And so you talked a little bit about that, and I've read a number of your filings in your defamation claims, and I recall one. There was a county that effectively said, and if I get this wrong, please correct me, but we just can't do business with you anymore. No one trusts Dominion. Can you tell us a little bit more about that if you're able to? If you can't, we can move on. But I think it's an important part to hit home that disinformation has longer impacts in terms of perception of the thing.
Right. Well, what I can say about it is we're living it every day. It's these tens of millions of people, in my estimation, that continue to believe these lies, that put pressure by the way of calling, complaining to election officials and their local election officials. And sometimes it's not even their local officials. It's officials from out of state. They don't even live there, and a lot of these people haven't even voted. But notwithstanding that, it's hard for a public election official and the board that they report to ignore that many constituents when they call in and they express concern, usually something along the lines of, the troubling issue with Dominion voting. Weren't they the company from November 2020? And, the fact of the matter is, with the number of audits that we've gone through, the hand recounts and hand audits, we are arguably the most vetted voting system out there. And unfortunately, that's not what they're saying. They're repeating the defamation. And when they're told about it, these are the actual facts, and this is how elections in your county are run. They say, well, we're still not sure, and we're still not convinced. That's
the illusion, right? The illusion of truth is you tell the lie often enough, and eventually it becomes dogma. It becomes the perceived truth, particularly if it's promoted by purported credible figures, at least those they look up to. And
that's the point. That's the point. How do you change that with people that you have no reach to? So it's got to be some along the lines of holding people to account, not at a governmental level, at a societal level for repeating falsehoods, things that are knowingly false, repeated with actual malice, and repeated on social media. We have to get to a culture of holding people to account, that words matter and lies matter. You can't just make things up maliciously.
Yeah, I continue to look for, and I know we talked about this back earlier in the year, but I look at problem sets linearly, almost like a systems engineer, and you look for those points of intervention. In cybersecurity, there's a kill chain, right? When an actor launches an attack, you have moments throughout the campaign where you can intercede, you can intervene, and you can disrupt. And I think that's a similar model that I'm thinking through. And I'd be interested in, I don't want to do we're going to close out with a conversation of what would we have done differently, and let's save that to the end. But in the meantime, what do you think those mechanisms are, those points of intervention in a broader disinformation operation and an influence campaign where what, again, let's go back, kind of bring forward the what worked. Is it the legal mechanisms, or are those not fast enough? Is it a broad messaging campaign, or is that not fast enough? I tend to think that it takes a village, right? It takes everyone, credible authorities. It takes third parties. It takes a group, though, to come together. So again, just really quick, what are those intervention points?
It's a great question. So we've tried several over 7 months. I mean, we've tried everything. As you know, we sampled every expert we could find to try to change hearts and minds and put facts out there. Unfortunately, the reality, the way I've seen it and experienced it over the last 7 months, is there is no ultimate authority that every person, every citizen can look to and say, this is the absolute truth. Whether we ever had that with the anchor at CBS News or whatever news, Walter Cronkite back in the day, we clearly don't have it now. So you talk about, kill chain. What are you supposed to do? When Fox is broadcasting a falsehood that they know to be false, that at best they're recklessly disregarding the truth, do you shut down the airing? I mean, you can't do that. When you talk about free speech, that's a central key part of our democracy. It's our hope that our efforts in the courts will just strengthen the First Amendment, not hurt it, because the fact of the matter is falsehoods are not protected. As they say, every single state has defamation laws. There's a reason why they have defamation laws. Freedom of speech, aside from it being a cornerstone of democracy, does not protect lying knowingly, especially with malicious intent that causes actual harm. So if there is a tool, a method, I haven't found it yet, Chris, and it's certainly not as it pertains to this defamation campaign.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and bring that forward and talk a little bit more. And I've done the same thing as you, looking back and thinking through what more could you have done? What more could Smartmatic have done? What more could any of these other people that were harmed throughout the various forks or branches of the disinformation campaign? And you bring up a really interesting point about freedom of speech. And what one of those things that I thought about was there an opportunity to seek injunctive relief earlier on? And really where I'm trying to go with this is take some of your lessons learned and help other executives start building out playbooks about how they need to be thinking, what a quick reaction team is, is that one of those levers that maybe you could have pulled but didn't? Is it a lever that you thought about, but it just wasn't there because of protected speech? Did you consider injunctive relief, a temporary restraining order against certain individuals, or was that just not politically in the cards?
I can't recall if we actually, we discussed so many different things with our legal teams in real time as it was happening. But I can tell you one thing that I definitely remember is feeling that the emotional need for candidates and their supporters when they lose elections. There is a very important part of the democratic process is to appeal your loss, is to ask for recounts. It's to ask the courts for relief and to go through the transparent process that we have across the country. It was my somewhat naive hope that this election was going to be the same as every other election that we've seen, certainly that I've seen over the last 18 years, where when it comes to a hand recount, the people that lose elections finally look in the mirror and they say, I guess we just didn't get enough people to vote for us. This is the first time, certainly for me, that I've seen something, and I think for anybody, certainly across the United States, that has seen something of this effect, where it went immediately to accusations of fraud and wrapped into a defamation campaign. So, with the benefit of hindsight, we were very reluctant to play an active part in trying to get any kind of injunctive relief, because we believe that aggrieved parties should have a chance to state their case and to pursue every avenue that is available to them under our laws. You put this in the context as if I've learned something over the last 7-8 months in terms of what the playbook. Our defamers continue to defame us.
Yeah.
They are making up new lies about us every single day, Chris. So we have sent countless of letters to them stating what they've said and explained to them how they are lies and the damage it's done and what the truth is. We've pointed to bipartisan independent sources for truth. And not only do they continue to do it, they continue to double, triple down. Like, I've lost track of where we are. We're certainly well past tripling and quadrupling down with a lot of the defamers. I mean, some of them have gone quiet and some of them have seemingly accepted the situation that they've caused for themselves. Whereas, as you fully well know that others have not, and they continue to do it. So if there's an answer, I certainly haven't found it.
Oh, I know. I sometimes on the weekends when I find a spare 15 minutes or so, I will watch the latest video that's been posted by the luminaries of the big lie, and it's remarkable. They're just, as I see it, my words, not yours, operating perhaps in a different reality with a different set of facts and maybe even a different set of physics.
So I'll tell you on that specific point, I can't tell you how many messages I get from friends, acquaintances that are somehow making light of the situation. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that every time these people or somebody new makes up something completely out of thin air, a complete lie with complete reckless disregard for the truth, it has real impacts, not just to us. The economic damage to us has been massive already, but to local election officials. The amount of messages that we get from local and state officials every time some new lie is presented in some dark corner of the internet and it spreads, this is a real impact for election administrators, and it hurts our democracy. It has a very, very terrible effect on it from the standpoint of pretty soon people are not going to want to do the job, and it's such an important job to do.
And you've already seen historic levels of retirements across the election administration community. Okay. All right, John. So we're going to play off a point you just made about, assuming you've learned something in this experience. I think we all have learned something. So what do you, how would you, this time next year, we'll just pick a date in the future, and you have an opportunity to go talk to a group of your peers, of CEOs in different industries. Disinformation, as I see it, it's been here all along in the corporate sphere. It is much more active in other geographies around the world, but we're absolutely seeing it right now in the vaccine, in the COVID vaccine space. We've seen it with 5G. Look at what happened on Christmas Day down in Nashville, Tennessee, outside of the AT&T building. That was related to just technology and 5G. So what do you say to a CEO about how they need to be thinking about disinformation? They've got cybersecurity investments, they've got PR investments, they have business continuity risks and international supply chain resilience measures. But what would you say to them about their need to think about disinformation in advance?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, first and foremost, is the absolute need for them to be aware of how fast disinformation can spread, and how it can catch like wildfire. That if it affects you, and you are part of a disinformation campaign, you have seconds to act, and that might be too late. The second thing that I'll say is get information and get the facts and the truth out there, even though people probably won't believe you. Foster relationships with government entities, on frankly bipartisan in my case, or the more varying and the higher number of independent experts that can vouch for reality and the truth and get it out there and make it available to the public for their consumption so they can actually understand, is critical. And the enemy really is the pervasiveness of misinformation, how fast it spreads, especially on social media, and how, given a preconceived bias, a personal bias to some effect, if there's a piece of disinformation that kind of strokes a pre-existing bias that a person might have, it's a deadly combination, and it's almost like you can't have enough facts on your side to try to battle that.
So, John, the shot clock is running out on us here, and let's close up with one final question and give us some quick thoughts. So, the Commission on Information Disorder, we're looking to make recommendations for government, platforms, civil society that can have an immediate impact on the harmful effects of the information disorder, as well as longer term recommendations. So, based on your experience, are there actions that government could take, that platforms could take, that the broader civil society community could take, that you'd like to see in the near future or the long term to prevent these sorts of things to happen to others?
In broad strokes, Chris, it would be creating a culture of responsibility and accountability, not just checks and balances at the individual level, but a systemic level, across all avenues of possible amplification of these things. This is includes social media, media outlets, and governments, society, individuals. We need to foster an environment where we hold people to account who spread misinformation with malicious intent and do so knowingly. And it's a fine line, because we have to first and foremost respect free speech, but along that line, we have to be very mindful that the free speech protections don't protect falsehoods.
Yeah. So I think that was from, as you said, the broad strokes. I think you cabined it up pretty well. The way I think about it, right, is in government, somebody needs to be looking out for these sorts of things. A senior person, a senior official that tracks it. Some evolution of what we were doing at CISA, informed by other partners. But then there are opportunities also, I see it, for the Election Assistance Commission and perhaps others, including the FCC and others, to keep a look at what's transpiring across the airwaves. And then on the platforms, policing their platforms from these sorts of harmful activities. And we talked about super spreaders earlier, and I think that's a way that's an area we need to dive into, because in elections, it really came down to about a dozen to maybe 24 individuals that promoted a lot of this. And then, lastly, we as a society have to hold these, our elected officials and those that are seeking higher office accountable. And I think there's still a pretty long tail on that story. So with that, John, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for coming on and participating in our Disinfo discussions. You've been through quite a lot the last year or so. And, as I sit here and look at the date that we record this, it's 7 months from the day that I was relieved from command over at CISA. And, a lot's changed in that 7 months, but it's good to see you continuing the fight. So thanks again for contributing, and good luck.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Always good talking to you, Chris.
All right, John. Thanks.